Welcome to this afternoon's talk. I'm Phillippa Duncan. I'll be moderating and keeping the ducklings at least in a vaguely straight line. Joining us today are Marieke Norton, Hoosein Mahomed, and Isaac Shongwe. And I'm going to give you the opportunity just to give a brief introduction in terms of who they are, what they do, and then we'll kick off into the passion of how and why they collect. Should we start with you?
Who are you pointing at? What?
You.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marieke Norton. I'm an anthropologist from Cape Town. I'm an environmental anthropologist, so I work with landscapes and people. And that, I think, sums it up at this point. Before I start ranting about art, I'm going to let Hoosein go.
And you have to save some of it up for us. Isaac, should we go to you next?
Yes, thank you. I'm Isaac Shongwe. I'm an entrepreneur, being an entrepreneur since 1996. Started a company called Letsema Holdings with a consulting firm in it. And I'm one of those people who believe that business should be a catalyst for social change. So I'm in business because if I succeed, then it makes me do the things that I care more about, like education and art.
Thank you. And Hoosein?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Phillippa. Thanks, Turbine, for giving me this opportunity. I'm Hoosein Mahomed, and I'm a lawyer. I have been practicing law for the past, I think, 13 years. I have offices in Joburg and in Cape Town, and I'm living in Cape Town. Yeah, that's all I have to say right now, Phillippa.
All right. Well, look, I'm going to sort of kick it off from my side. You know, one of the things I love about these kind of forums is hearing about how and why people collect, because I think everyone has a different entry point, everyone has a different background. You know, some people are in the positions where their parents collected or their grandparents collected, so it's really become part of their kind of their familial DNA. Whereas for a lot of us, it's simply a case of we one day saw that one thing we couldn't live without. And, you know, from my side, what I'd like to kind of put to the floor now is what prompted your collecting? You know, what was it about that first piece that you saw and you had to have that drove you down this, you know, steep path of collecting, because it's like a tumbleweed that just gathers momentum?
Yes.
And I'm opening it up to whoever wants to tackle it first.
Well, I'm going to jump in. I feel like I possibly, as the younger and possibly smaller collection out of the group, definitely, as you mentioned, it's an intergenerational thing with me. My parents were avid collectors. And not having a lot of cash, I mean, they collected some interesting pieces in the 70s, but over the years, you've come to realize that they've become quite not prominent names even, but established names. So it's something I grew up with. It was definitely something, you know, you could sacrifice some other things in order to buy a piece of art. So it's kind of a ethos that I've grown up with. And the first piece, and I can't believe how cheap it was now, but it was years ago when I stumbled on a Scotchness print in the Milnerton flea market. Bought it thinking there's no way that I just bought a Scotchness at the flea market. And then I had it verified and it actually was. And I think that was like, wow, that was a moment for me. It was a very proud moment in my life. And it felt like a little gift, a bit of luck. Seeing a Scotchness has always been one of my favorites. So that was it for me.
I think there's an incredible amount of achievement that comes with that first acquisition, and a find such as that at a flea market, where the last thing you expect is to actually find a genuine work, I think makes it all that more, you know, sort of flavorful as time goes. Yeah. Who's going to tackle it next?
I think I'll go next. I think for me, it started more, you know, I never knew much about art, you know, but when I started working, I used to like to go to secondhand furniture places where they kind of like make, you get these really old furniture style, like in the Bruma area. There's a couple of those, and in West Dean and Newlands. I used to go there just looking at this old furniture pieces, and then started seeing kind of like art pieces. And then I stumbled into something which I looked at, and it really resonated, with me. And then I started adding up to, going to old furniture places, and, looking for art as well, and sometimes there would be kind of like, art auctions where people have like these pieces. And at first it was very, basic, pieces. And I remember discovering Sauli, as a first, kind of like artist, So for me, the passion developed just, I buy what kind of appeals to my eye and appeals to my soul. I need to look at the piece, and it has to be a piece that it gives me some happiness, to look at. And as I evolve, collecting, you find that then you start, learning about what sometimes I call the snobbery of art collection, where there would be kind of like, big names and all these kind of like, and I started kind of being at first a bit surprised about how expensive art pieces, could be. And some of them, I've looked at them, and they were just not, doing it for me, especially the modern art, because some of it is just, one of those things where and it reminded me of Andy Warhol with his tomato can soups, where you just peg these cans there, and it became an art piece. And those things were going for big money, and I just never understood it. So for me, at the core of my kind of like, collection, and I've gotten to the state where my wife sometimes thinks I'm totally addicted, to art. I'm involved with, I'm a patron at the Vets Arts Museum. I'm on a board of Aspire, the auction house with Ruok. And recently I've been invited to sit on the board of the Javits Museum at the University of Pretoria. So over time, in terms of just seeing, I've got a sizable collection, and some of the stuff that I really, like and enjoy is pieces of art which don't cost that much, but I just love, and I wouldn't sell them for anything. And I've started graduating into buying and into getting into Pemba, into Sekoto, into Midafeni, into Semtengetwa, into Mohau. So my style tends to be more like the old stuff. I don't understand the contemporary stuff that much.
Okay. And Hoosein?
Hi, Phillippa. I started collecting, I think, in about 2007. Most of my friends were collectors. As you know, Russell Kaplan is one of my very good friends who owns the auction house. And I had, while I was at law school, I also had a very good friend called Lorna Ferguson. And she was considered to be Miss Art at the time. And so I started associating with the right people. And I recall being at the first Joburg, my first Joburg art fair around about, I think, 2007. And the first artwork that I bought was a Caroline de Villiers. It was a little watercolor. And because I'm fascinated by Afrikaans and Afrikaner masculinity, etc., it said, van boer op die wagtoring sien ek alles. And so I knew I had to have that work, but it wasn't an easy buy. I remember Lorna standing with me and saying to me, okay, so are you going to buy it or not? And so I was like, no, it's too expensive. And it actually wasn't. And she took out a credit card. She bought it for me. And she sent me the bill the next day and said, here's your invoice, you got to pay for it. And so my collecting had begun with Caroline de Villiers, a very beautiful watercolor. And thereafter, it became many more things, because as you say, that it really is a an addictive experience of beginning to create new sort of engagement, like all of us are friends and we share common interest, and I think this is what sort of like binds us. And so I felt that for me, it was never really so much about collecting things. It was more about the conversations that revolved around the artworks, and up until now, we're still having those same types of conversations.
Well, I think that's incredibly important because, at the end of the day, you've got to have a working dialogue with what's on your walls or on pedestals or, wherever the artworks are, are positioned. And I think if that dialogue wears away and it's no longer sort of, talking to you and you're not talking back to it, I think that's potentially where, that point when collectors, sort of start looking at things and going, maybe it's time that we start sort of shifting that one out, pulling something else in. And I mean, Hoosein, I'm very familiar with your collection. So I mean, I've watched you over the last 5-6 years in terms of what's moved in and out, and I think that's also important. It's one thing having the luxury of being able to put things in a storeroom and rotate, but it's another thing just actively thinking, right, I don't want to keep it in a storeroom. I need to live with it, and actively moving things in and out.
Yeah.
Then the next thing that interests me is coming from your 3 quite sort of disparate backgrounds. Marieke, essentially part of your work is educational, and the fact that you work for UCT, but you were also saying that, with the anthropological side that, you're interested in landscape and people. Do you find that your respective backgrounds, you're saying with you in law, Isaac, you were saying leadership is an incredibly important part of your business, and, being able to put back into education and art. Do you find that also shapes how you collect? Wanting to use your personal and professional experiences in creating that visual voice around you in your collections.
Phillippa, can I answer that?
Sure.
I think that you're right. Collecting is a very personal experience. And I recall actually sitting with one of my therapists once, and she said to me, why don't you photograph all the artworks in your collection as we begin to map your identity from artwork to artwork as the years progress, And so I think that it's a lot to do with, for example, my grandparents came down to South Africa in the early 1900s. And so we've been here for over a century. And so I've always felt that the art collecting was me beginning to interrogate myself within a South African context. What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be Indian and privileged? And so the artworks were collected based on all of the things that affected me. So I don't think it's so much about the profession. I think it's definitely about where we are in our lives. And so every artwork has a story, whether it's the Mahaus or whether it's the Kudzanai Charais or whether it's the Attis. I can tell you a story about love and friendship. And I mean, probably when I met you for the first time, there were artworks that I would have bought at that particular time. And so you become intertwined in the artworks. And so it becomes, for some of us, it becomes a very, very personal experience. And so we are intrinsically linked to them, and to let them go becomes a very emotional experience.
I mean, it's weaving those works into your own biography in that sense. And it does become part of you. And I mean, I always say to clients that if we're looking at acquiring something new or letting something else go, it is very much like as though you're having to make decisions about family members. I remember the first work I bought, and I remember the first work I sold, and both things brought me different things at different times. Isaac, I'm quite interested in your collection in terms of the fact that you mentioned earlier that you almost started at a more contemporary point and worked backwards to the historical. Very often, I mean, Marieke, you mentioned with your parents that they were buying works in the 70s, not because they were looking ahead for them to increase in value, but because they just genuinely liked them, they spoke to them, etc. Whereas Isaac, in a sense, you've almost gone backwards down that journey. Has that just been as your tastes have changed, or you've learned more about the artists and the history?
for me, I think that there's an element of it which is political and societal, because once you kind of like, again, if one, I like different forms of art, I love music, I love theater, and sometimes you kind of like, I started reflecting in terms of the role that theater had played during the apartheid. So it was kind of like a voice, which has led me to believe that sometimes art can be kind of like a window through which you can get to the soul of a nation, a soul of a people. And if you look at the older stuff, there's that kind of like element, of sadness. And you look some of Dumila Fendi's kind of like, work. There's a lot of kind of like emotion and struggle kind of intertwined, kind of like, with that. And as I got more kind of like, as I'm educating myself, and when my wife and I travel, one of the first things we go to is the art gallery, to see. And then you go to, to Ghana, you go to Nigeria, you go, it gives, for me, it gives like a sense of, the soul kind of like of a nation, because it's an expressive way of what people are experiencing, and sometimes in South Africa, I'm being a little bit kind of like, surprised in terms of like where I'm seeing a gap between kind of like, post-apartheid, stuff. I mean, you take someone like Sam, there's still an element of that, but most of the modern art, there's something there for me, kind of like from how I've based, and put the framework or kind of how, I collect. So like in my collection, there are different experiences that gets depicted by different, pieces, of art. So I've come to combine what I enjoy in looking at a piece and the meaning that the piece kind of, gives. You can move from something very simple to something very aggressive, like the spear, when that kind of came up, and the emotion of how that, played through, culturally, and racially. So I enjoy increasingly the kind of the meaning of the arts in society. Do the arts have a place to play in society? And I think they do. And if we're in an environment where the arts are not as supported as they should be, we are missing out on really, seeing and having like the glimpses of, people who live in Alex, people who live, in squatter camps, and so for me, kind of like all that has forced me to really start digging deeper. Like in my business, I've created a foundation, and one of the focus area, is the arts. I do leadership, the arts, the aged and education, and I just find like the art traversing, different, spaces that we all occupy.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Marieke, for you?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, there's not much more to be said. I mean, I believe deeply that the arts are intrinsic to life on Earth, to humans, to how we process things. As an anthropologist, I see that some of our most useful fieldwork methods aren't speaking to people, it's watching people and often watching them perform or make a piece of art. And it's amazing how much we can learn about the patterns we live by the kind of things that people choose to put on their wall and we choose to put on their wall, and how differently we'll all see a single piece of art. So my journey has been very much raised in a house with some sort of racy art and a little bit politicized. in the 70s. And so for me, I've always, maybe if you're aware of it, you see it, but I think growing up in Cape Town and in, working at UCT during Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, it's always been a fantastic way for me to engage with each phase of my life. So sort of when I was becoming adult and moving to my own place, I had a lot of the older stuff, which was definitely came directly from my parents' aesthetic, sort of one of the few things I didn't rebel against, was their taste in art. And then building up and noticing over the years how there's these phases of things I've been drawn to. And then equating them to my context, always, consciously or subconsciously, and then getting married and then having to negotiate that to different tastes. So I've got some of my favorite pieces in this room with me because it's my office and the door closes and it's not sort of for the general house, and it's not even racy or anything. It's just the aesthetic doesn't fit with the rest of the house. Sort of this, my 5-year-old son. So like what kind of art can we put on the wall with a 5-year-old son? Sometimes you have to question that. It's interesting to think, sort of start asking yourself about a piece when you just think about like, oh, could we put this there? And then all these kind of things start to unravel. So it's always fun. I mean, who can't not talk about art for hours?
Well, that's it. And I mean, I think also, I love the fact that you're saying, for example, that you've got a young child who's sort of, becoming that third generation or even fourth generation. I don't know if your grandparents collected, but, that next generation who's already growing up around art. And I think, for me, that's something I've found as a South African, that collecting is quite an alien culture to so many of us, because art was something you would see in a museum. If you didn't have the budget or you weren't in those circles, you certainly never went into a gallery. And I think that's also where platforms like Turbine become so important, because the first Turbine Art Fair had a financial cap on available artworks of, I think it was sort of 30 or 40,000 rand. And the idea was to really bring art to a wide public. Anyone could access the fair, come and see. You'd have a lot of families going through. And of course, now with the COVID situation, that's all changed. It's gone digital. And I think for many people, that has both broadened the access, and yet for a lot of other people, it's making art more difficult to access again. And it's all about whether or not, do we have the smartphone? Do we have the laptop? Do we have the internet access? So, I think going forward, collecting is going to change on many levels. And bringing me around to that is how many of you, if any of you, have you actually bought something purely based on a digital presentation? So PDF, photograph, so never physically having seen that work.
I haven't.
Yeah, look, Phillippa, I think that the digital platform has definitely been a challenge for most of us. But what it's also done is it's also created a greater availability of artwork. So what we're seeing at the moment is the galleries all scrambling to put the artists on. So whether it's Goodman or Stevenson, etc. So suddenly we're beginning to see work and beginning to understand quality. Because before we were never allowed to see so much of content. And so now we're beginning to see, and I think that we had a discussion about this before, is that as we're beginning to see more and more artists paint in the same way. Everywhere we look, we're seeing the same type of painting. And I think this is more so on the digital platform. And so in a way, besides giving accessibility to more and more people on a digital platform, it's also making us very smart about what is good art? Are people all saying the same thing? And if everybody is saying the same thing, are we then interested in buying it? Because when it was being shown at Goodman Gallery, but it wasn't online, some of us were missing that particular show, and then we were at Stevenson. But now suddenly we're seeing, is everybody saying the same thing? And so I think that it's a very interesting time. But I'm definitely finding it very difficult to log onto the platforms. I know that Latitudes was showing something quite innovative, where artists were showing their own work. It's not something that I would want to log on. I think that we've all got digital fatigue. And And so we're waiting for the museums and the galleries to like open again so that we can actually see the work properly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also, you know, in terms of this digital access, one of the things that it's offered some of the smaller galleries, but again, it depends on their preparedness for having entered this digital platform, is it's given them a wider audience. It's certainly given them a better international audience. Unfortunately, as we already know, a lot of really, you know, supportive, you know, I hate using this, but lower tier galleries who were showing emerging artists, etc., are not going to reopen after, you know, after lockdown changes, because they simply weren't able to reappoint themselves at a digital level. But I think it's also about how the platforms present themselves. I mean, I'll go online and I'll look at something and it's, you know, it's a bunch of images on a wall. I quite like the digital viewing rooms where it's as though you're walking around a room. I think it's a far more interactive and friendly platform. I think it's Artsy or Vortic, one of them, have a thing where you can have a look at this artwork in your own room, and whoops, it accesses the camera on your phone, and you scan the wall where you think your artwork might hang in future. And, you know, you sort of point it at the four corners that it tells you to, and off you go. You imagine the artwork in your room. It's still not the same as seeing it. I mean, I remember seeing the girl with the, you know, Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl Earring for the first time. It was a totally different experience. But I think that we are going to get more used to these digital platforms, also from ease. And the faster you are with the click of the button, the faster it's yours. So,
Phillippa, I will say this, though, that for example, if you look at an artist like Mashekwa Langa, who I think is one of the best South African artists, because he paints like a dream, or whether you're looking at Georgina Gatrix and the thickness and the quality of the paint, etc., that cannot translate in the digital format. You know, how do you see the perfection of Mashekwa Langa in digital? And so I think that irrespective of how this whole pandemic thing turns out, we have to see it to understand its beauty, you know.
No, absolutely. I mean, I've always maintained that certain artists you just can't buy from an image. You know, in terms of historical artists, I immediately put Pierneef and Robert Hodgins on that platform. They just don't translate well in photographs. Other artists, you can kind of feel your way around. I mean, I've also shown an artwork before to someone that happened to be by Georgina, and the first thing they said to me is, "There's not enough paint on it." So, you know, again, it's about collectors' perceptions of what they should be getting, you know, by that artist at this time. Now, I read an article recently. It was an interview with an American collector called Beth Rudin DeWoody, and firstly, she said that, you know, she buys works early on. That's one of her buying practices. She uses various advisors for this kind of thing. And she's recently gone into contemporary African art as well. And for her, it's very much, it's about having the work for as long as she wants. But she has a very strong ethos of patronage in how she buys and what she buys. And she has very close ties with a number of institutions. Where do you see the future of your collections? I mean, Isaac, you putting together a historical collection. You know, do you imagine passing it on? Do you imagine with your connections with both the Wits Art Museum and Jabbit that you might look at donating that collection in future? Or is it something in case that you're building a legacy for your family or a legacy for yourself?
I think it's more for me of a legacy thing, and I think art is to be shared, you know, and I'm hoping that, you know, over time, one would, you know, either create a space, you know, where kind of like, you know, the collection, you know, would be viewed and open to, you know, to the public, and again, for like, you know, intergenerational, you know, to start educating the kids, you know, on the love of the arts, you know, and some of it might sort of like go to them, but it's more of saying kind of how do we use the arts in the public interest, you know, and that's why I'm enjoying now kind of like the work that the Javits UP is trying to do in connecting kind of like the arts, and the surrounding communities in terms of how do you start, taking the arts into Mamelodi, into Atteridgeville, into Soshanguve, kind of like, those spaces. Because for me, the accessibility is a big thing. Because I think art tends to be very kind of elitist, in its nature. It's supposedly certain people understands and kind of like, collect art. But growing up in Alex, and you'd go kind of like in most houses, either it would be a photograph or something, there would be something hanging on the wall, but that experience does not necessarily kind of like translate into how, generally the art is viewed or seen as something that, in one way or the other, it has an appeal, to everyone, and then the accessibility and the affordability tends to then make it kind of like that unaccessible. For me, I kind of struggle to say, how do I play a role long term in kind of like making it, accessible and supporting, the emerging artists. So that's why I enjoy what you guys are doing, with the program that you are involved, with. And I find it very difficult in terms of actually parting with some of the pieces. I'm yet to sell a piece, because I just, it becomes, it becomes part and parcel, of who I am. I enjoy it for, and therefore I've got different spaces. Like I've got my offices in Melrose Arch, it's, the way I've structured it, it's a mini art gallery, the stuff that I enjoy and I see every day and I live with it, and it just feeds my soul.
Yeah, I'm just going to touch on a couple of things that have sort of been put up in the chat box, and there seems to be a consensus that definitely education people, the public, need to be able to get to institutions in order to be able to view and to to experience art. So, one of the comments from Debbie is why I like the Wits Art Museum public engagement. Everyone gets to go, there are no fees, it's less elitist. Behind that, of course, is an incredibly strong fundraising drive, with that Wits Museum has run ever since it opened. I unfortunately haven't been to the Javit yet. It's been closed, very annoying, even when I was in Gauteng, but that's just the way it goes. I mean, our local institutions here in Cape Town, Mako at the waterfront, the Zeiss, they obviously charge a fee to enter. The Norval charges a fee to enter. Even our National Gallery in Cape Town charges a fee to enter. And that is very often what keeps people away. It's also accessibility. Is there transport getting people to those places? I mean, in Johannesburg, for example, Joburg Art Gallery, everyone goes, ooh, well, it's really not in a great place anymore. It's not. But imagine if there was a proper shuttle service getting people there. Imagine buses physically picking people up in, Rosebank or a central transport hub, or taking people from Soweto or Alex or wherever it is on these tours, and without preaching to the people, just getting them to experience it. I volunteered at Wits Art Museum when it first opened as a docent, and I was fortunate to work, to be there when they had the Sokoto exhibition, and I was fascinated by the fact that they got this incredible number of young school kids in to come and see the art, to experience it. And there are just all those opportunities. And I see Cheryl's added there are free days at Zeiss, Norval, and the National Gallery. Absolutely, yes. There are. But if it was free every day, and if transport was there, I think that would make a big difference. But
right.
I'm rabbiting on, and I'm not getting nearly enough from you guys. So, I'm starting to feel bad here. So Isaac, you mentioned that, yours is legacy. Now, is that private legacy? Are you looking to donate it? Do you want people to experience your collection? Are you going to build your own museum?
No, I don't know. At this stage, I mean, my wife and I have a little place that we like in the cradle, on the beginning of the cradle in the Meldersdrift area, where we spend a lot of time. And I've got this thing that people, they like to drive out to the country, over weekends, so maybe as a starting point, because I'm getting to a stage where there's just this art which is not hanging anywhere, which I feel bad about. So I might build a little space where it would just be kind of like open, but again, having seen in terms of what has happened to some of the collection of people like Magubane, the photographs with a small, space that was created in Soweto, which ended up being neglected, maybe kind of like it ends up in the academic institution, as part of, the education, program, I don't know. At the moment, I'm just enjoying it, but
that's also what art's about, and that actually ties in quite nicely with bringing in the idea of looking after your collection. And in terms of future acquisitions, do you find out? I mean, and this is a particular problem that can crop up with contemporary artworks, is that the materials that the artists are using are just simply not meant to be permanent. And I heard it summarized beautifully a couple of months ago where somebody said, at some point certain museums are just going to have to resign themselves to the fact that their Ansam Pifa is just simply going to continue to fall apart. Now, that's all very well, but you put $15 million on the line to get that Ansam Pifa into your collection. From a museum's point of view, you want to be able to show it. So as collectors, you living with this artwork in your homes, do you keep an eye on it? Do you get someone else to keep an eye on it? Do you work with a curator who comes in and inspects everything? I'm just always interested to know how aware people are of, what's happening within their collections on their walls.
Phillippa, I must say that I'm not checking up on that a lot. I know that the artworks, if you come to my house, it's all over the place. It's on the floor, in the offices, etc. So yeah, I'm just enjoying them. I'm not really thinking too much about preservation, but I think it's something that we need to think about. I often think about the Nandipa work on the lawns at the Norval. That was lying in the water.
Yeah, the bronze.
and that completely disintegrated, and obviously that takes that's ongoing maintenance, stuff like that. So yeah, but no, I haven't been thinking about it. But I also wanted to touch on the issue of Black collectors and how to cultivate new collectors. Because I think that it's very difficult for Black collectors to enter the market. And also the issue of the longevity of collections. So a lot of Black collectors want to buy artworks, but they also find themselves in a position where, does the artwork have value in the long term because they don't come from generational wealth and all of those things. And then what does it mean to put the works onto the secondary market, and how that particular issue is frowned upon. So I think those are the type of things that Black collectors are facing right now, as they've always done.
Yeah, I understand the economics stumbling blocks. I also think Tanya Peterson has just brought up a very good point here, which is, why does people assume that only some people understand art? There's still that sort of that intellectual elitism. It shouldn't be about understanding the art. It should be about the interpretation. How do you feel when you see it? And I think that's still, along with the economics, a massive stumbling block for people when it comes to collecting. Marieke, you look like you want to say something. You want to say something.
I want to say something. No, because I mean, it's very clear to me, and I want to make it, I'm at a very different point in my collection from the two gentlemen. I'm on a panel where I couldn't even think of getting rid of artwork. I'd be left with, I'm not at that stage at all. I'm not sure I'll ever be. But I think that was a big thing for me, is to start going, and I'm, in a privileged position. I've got all the, generation knowledge behind me. But to really walk into an art gallery or an art fair in particular, which is a very sort of hybrid space of personalities, and to be like, you know what, I have no shame on about my budget, and I don't really care that much about, to be fair, often the artist conceptualization, unless it is a political piece or something about gender-based violence or something that I really care about. So it's also just to be like, you don't have to engage in conversation about it. If the person comes up to me like, Sodi, what do you think about, this period in his work? You'd be like, no clue. So to learn as a new collector, have no shame about your ignorance or budget, because otherwise you'll never get anywhere. It's a hard space to get into. So just be as bold as everyone else in that space.
I mean, I'd also suggest that in the traditional model of the art fair, prices are something that they're not put on walls, they're not put on the actual, catalog list. If you are, if you ask for it, if you actually want to know the price, you have to go, how much is it? And I think that's changed at the digital level, because in order for galleries to cope, in order for artists to cope, honestly, it's changed things. It's certainly, I've seen it opening up. And Hoosein, Tanya would like you to comment. I'm just going to read out.
What is
so Tanya's basically said it boggles the mind that the assumption is that pure people don't understand or appreciate art when they make the art most of the time. So
I think that. Yes, I think that that's one of the dilemmas, I think, in the art community at the moment, is that a lot of the art is being made for a specific audience. And so if you look at, I'll give you an example of Zanele Maholi. She does obviously the fascinating portraits of queer identity, which was really incredible work. And thereafter, she's now been doing a lot of the Sonyama work, which is incredible political, taking the black body to places that it has never been, to begin to see nuances and the shadows within the black body, etc. But it's also very decorative, and it is being positioned for a specific audience. So what does it mean to make all of this political art, but it is being directed to a white audience? And at the moment, if you go to most of the galleries, everything is priced in euros. Everything is priced in dollars. Nothing is priced in rand. So you walk into the gallery, they tell you straight, it's 30,000 euros. So it's all being positioned for a European audience, and yet it's speaking of the African experience. So I think those are the interesting dynamics that are happening in the art world. And also, it's a supply and demand market. No matter how we want to look at it, it's all, if we take a whole lot of work and we put it onto the secondary market, the prices collapse. So it's all about getting a certain number of collectors, make sure that they buy out the editions or buying the work, and that they hold on to it in order to retain the collections. So I've had instances. I obviously don't come from generational wealth. I've sold on all the auctions, because if hard times hit, you got to sell. That's the reality of the situation. And of course, it's frowned upon. And so you will then go back to the same galleries and you will try and buy, and they will make sure that they're selling it only to specific buyers, because they're trying to retain the entire edition without any sales. And so is it a controlled market? Is it elitist? Is it keeping people out? Yeah, absolutely it is. I think I've been long enough in the contemporary art community that I don't care. I walk in everywhere and I'm not really concerned about what anybody thinks. I engage with everybody. I know most of the people. So it doesn't really affect me. But if you're a new buyer and you think you're just going to come in there, it could become quite a dilemma, I think. I hope I answered Tanya's question, and I want to say
I'm sure we'll hear about it in a moment.
Yeah, and I will say that I love Tanya Peterson's work. She's one of my favorite artists, so I'm really pleased that she's posed a question. Thank you, Tanya.
I mean, Isaac,
just to add to that, I mean, from what Hoosein has just said, and I think that for me, it's kind of like unfortunate because if you're like a youngster and you go to a gallery, you go to Goodman Gallery or Everett Reed, and you walk around, you might kind of like something, but the price just kind of like pushes you away because it's like as if kind of like, you know, you are not there yet. So you're not, you know, and I find that there are very little spaces, you know, to where one can go and really see something cool and something good, which doesn't cost kind of like that much, you know. And I think that kind of like issue, then how do we then start cultivating? It's very difficult to cultivate, you know, young people start kind of like with that first piece, you know, if the distribution channel is, you know, it's very kind of like, you know, limited. And you know, why can't one go in somewhere in Alex, in the middle of Alex, and set up kind of like something with an emerging artist in that community where they have space, you know, to display kind of their stuff. And those of us who are interested in art, having a commitment of supporting, you know, and going in there and supporting those young kind of like emerging artists, which is one thing which I enjoy doing, to meet some of the young emerging artists, you know, as they come along, in terms of really trying to sort of like, you know, to help them out as they are, you know, establishing themselves. And I think because of the price point, when one gets to that space where you start kind of like buying, you know, some of the stuff which is kind of like, you know, expensive, that's where then, you know, I just think that you start thinking, because then it ends up becoming an investment, and you have to make sure that what you're buying, one, is authentic, because there's a lot of stuff out there. You think that you're buying a Pemba, you know, and meanwhile it's a Pemba wannabe, you know, and the preservation and getting the stuff, you know, evaluated and preserved, which is only now. I mean, I've been kind of doing this for the last, you know, when I first started, for the last kind of like 20 years. But it's only that when I'm starting to sort of like saying, well, you know, this piece might need some, you know, looking after. Then I need to go and talk to some of the, restorers, you know. So I think once you start get to that level, it becomes a different kind of like, you know, ball game. But art should be accessible, you know, to most kind of like people. And as a result, that's why in my office, and my first business was a strategy consulting firm. I've got over 100 young people there, you know, and from time to time I bring in kind of like the artists like Sam, you know, like Phillippa, to talk to the young people and to talk about kind of like, collection, to have kind of like a dialogue, you know, with those, young people. And I think that is important, though, to make sure that we, you know, I don't know how we can do it, you know, but it has to be, for me, the big issue is kind of like is the accessibility and affordability.
Well, I think something that came out of the sort of the international lockdown was certainly in the overseas model, was some of the really top tier galleries hosting smaller galleries, hosting unknown artists on their various well-established digital platforms in order to boost them and get them through the months of lockdown. And I think that's where the art fairs have become important at the local level. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, as you said, it's accessibility. So who's going to pick up, you know, that banner? I mean, you have emerging galleries at Turbine. Guns and Rain immediately springs to mind. Julie's one of those gallerists who is incredibly supportive of her artists. And if it's a case of she provides the launching platform for them and they move on to another gallery, so be it. She knows it's part of the process. But I mean, I would like to see, as you said, those young artists who are working in places like Alex, I'd like to see them getting support beyond that, so that also emerging collectors can have access to their work. More established collectors can, in a sense, pacify themselves by saying, oh, it's emerging investment, so we can put our money there for the moment because we're supporting it now, and get that far more organic collecting process happening. So, I mean, in your various capacities, how would you see that kind of support going forward?
I kind of want to also quickly just go back to the previous point. I mean, I think we're all aware at this stage of sort of the structural difficulties in sort of making sites accessible. I mean, or a space like sites. I don't want to put them on any kind of, So, as Isaac was saying, like, it shouldn't be about coming into this space. It should be very much about the same kind of enjoyment getting, or same kind of, whatever you phrase it, however it's getting into that space. And it is accessibility. And I think about like one of the very elite industries in the country for a very long time, the wine industry. So growing up in Stellenbosch and seeing like years people trying to educate, because now there was this emerging black market, particularly, and they were really targeting them like, these are the wines, these are good wines, this is what good wine is. Until the young black wine entrepreneurs were like, no, hey, what do you guys like drinking? Oh, do you want to hear about that wine? It was very much, and I think there's a massive shift in a lot of different dynamics in the situation when you approach it like that. We shouldn't be telling people, you guys need to come learn art here. It should be just, and honestly, not to be, I mean, I'm not quite millennial, I'm sort of upper millennial, but really in this time in lockdown, seeing how many young artists are getting their patronage from their peers on platforms like Instagram. I've got an immense amount of young Black South African artists who are making a go of it. They still try to exhibit in galleries. I'm not saying the gallery space is dead at all. I'm in no position to say that. I'm just saying that they're finding the patronage themselves, and the patronage is not coming from this elitist 30,000 euro like collector sphere. It's coming from their peers. It's coming from much younger people from their neighborhood. Some of it very, very loyal based. It's sort of like, guys, here's an artist from Elsie's River. Like, you go, upvote this, gotta go. And I've never bought an art in a digital space, but I've definitely learned more about art in these burgeoning digital platforms. Definitely like local upcoming artists than I have in a lot of other art spaces. So that's definitely something. And I've actually forgot the actual question that I jumped.
Well, don't worry, you and me both. But I also just need to I just need to make sure that I kept up with the so Debbie also mentioned here that Insta's been a serious boost for artists at the emerging stage. I mean, I've certainly seen, I mean, I follow thousands on Instagram. I love it. But I mean, I've seen artists starting to post more and more work. And also then the flip side from that is getting picked up not only by collectors, but getting picked up by galleries and suddenly being offered residencies and things like that. And I mean, I'd like to see the fact that digital and social media is opening that collecting field, that it does mean collectors start collecting more at that level. I mean, I've never been afraid of buying something having only seen it digitally, because I always like to think that I've been looking at bad photographs of art for so many years that I can fill in a lot of the blanks. It's like you should see some of the photos I get sent. But, so I look at it that way. I also tend to buy a lot of graphic art, so that does make, a difference. But, in terms of collecting and waiting lists, and those dreaded waiting lists, those ones where the gallerist says to you, oh, I've got 100 people on it. 100. Yeah, you've got no, they're not even taking commissions. But has there ever been that piece of art that you saw and it hit you right there, kind of squarely in the chest, and you didn't go for it and you still beat yourself up about it?
Well, years ago, a Jake Eichmann, which would have been unaffordable. But considering what the same size painting by Eichmann, I should have just sold something.
Provitas for 6 months. I've heard that works.
I don't know
Salty cracks.
Yeah. maybe not a kidney, but I definitely sort of like, I don't know, my stove and my TV, probably all I had at the point to sell anyway. I would have sold my stove and TV for an early Eichmann, yeah.
Okay, all right. And Isaac, for you? Has there ever been that piece you missed?
I think that they were kind of much earlier on with Makamo, because he was, when he started out, I looked at his stuff, but at first I just thought that it's kind of, I liked it. But I thought it kind of like it was a bit overpriced. But in hindsight, I could have, really kind of like, supported, if one was in that mindset of, yes, it's, you look at it, it's okay, but you support, and maybe one could have gotten into it much kind of like, better, because there was a time when, as a youngster, he had approached me in terms of like saying, hey, look, here's the stuff, this is what I'm trying to do. I just sometimes kick myself. And that's why now I kind of like very, consciously kind of like engage with young people, who are kind of like emerging artists, and support.
Yeah. And Hoosein, who got away?
Phillippa, I must say that I can't really think of anyone that got away. I mean, I do think about Tanya Peterson light boxes and Ati Pataruga tapestries and stuff like that. But I do know that the artist that usually influenced me when I started collecting, and I've said this before, was Nandipa Mtambo in Prakadaturos. I felt that was a moment in South African contemporary art history that was just revolutionary. What she did then was just unbelievable, and people are still, as you know, people are still looking for the prints, more particularly the one where she emulated Conchita Martinez and the first female matador. And so I do think about those moments that felt like they were changing, when art just became everything. And I must say that I've never felt like I've had a moment like that before. Again, since that moment. But I do see a lot of artists, and of course, I like artists like say, for example, Bronwyn Katz, or say Bernie Searle. And I mean, the works are still available, so I suppose you could go and buy it. So I don't think there's anything that I've missed, really.
Well, yeah, I still remember that one time I wanted to buy I think it was a PNF lino cut, and I couldn't afford it, and now I certainly can't afford it because they've gone through the roof. I'm also quite conscious of the time, because I think we've probably only got sort of a minute and a bit. So just in terms of sort of wrapping up, in terms of collecting contemporary, how important is it for you as collectors to get to know the artists you're collecting? Does that add to the emotional and long-term connection between you and those works?
Oh, absolutely. I think most of my friends are curators and artists, and I love engaging with them. I mean, yesterday, Tanya Peterson took me through OBS, and she took me to second-hand stores, and we bought second-hand clothing together. So, I mean, I get to experience her in a way, and then begin to see the artworks, and it's a fascinating experience. Yes.
Yes and no. I definitely have some artworks by friends which I adore because I know them, and I feel like I can see deeper meanings in it because of it. But I definitely have, like one little, a couple that I know would never have met the artist. They've passed away, or they're just totally out of my social circle. And then there's one where it was sort of, kind of met the artist after the fact, and then I Yeah.
And you're stuck with that artwork.
Yeah, and I was kind of like, oh, okay. So it's always just, it depends. I don't, I also do want to, that's why we're saying the feeding your soul, right? And I just want to get back to that. For me, that's the contemporary art part of it, is engaging with the kind of zeitgeist, with the soul of the day, but also feeding yourself. I feel like if you are going to start collecting and you don't know a lot, start with the contemporary stuff, maybe stuff that you feel more comfortable with because it's in your context. I mean, going back, you can research the bigger names, but it really has to speak to you. All this market-related stuff, for a young collector, that's very hard to negotiate. And I mean, so I really want to stress that if it is something that you're interested in, to follow us. So if you're very interested in artists, follow that. But if you don't care about the artists and you only care about, so don't, there's really, you don't have to take all of this on board. You can have a very straightforward, which is how I started. We're like, that's so pretty. I can afford it. Yay. Like that's
win-win.
Win-win. You don't have to overthink it.
Yeah.
Always, unless you are going for that very market-related kind of investing, collecting, which is, I think we've been talking two different kinds, or at least I've been talking about a different type of collecting. Yes, to Hoosein and Isaac.
Yeah.
Oh.
I don't know. It feels like you guys are talking about secondary markets and stuff. I'm like, none of my.
At the risk of oversimplifying it, when I looked at the panel today, I thought, well, it's kind of, you've got that small, medium, and large. You've got, you've got, you've got the emerging collector. You've got Hoosein, who's sort of, he's already had an exhibition at an institution of his collection. Isaac, who's lives with it in his home, lives with it in his office, has a historical as well as contemporary pieces. So that really was the way that I looked at it. So I'm just wanting to know. I'm just sort of having a look over here. The ones that got away. Tanya says, "Oh, she missed the opportunity to swap with Bronwyn Katz." I mean, I also know that's how a lot of artists get their own collections, is doing artistic swaps. And then certainly, I think for emerging collectors, one of the things to also remember is that the studio is not an inaccessible space. If you really do love a particular artist, and maybe right now you can't afford them, but that they work with this gallery, is go and speak to that gallery and find out about studio visits. So you can actually go and, kind of learn about the process, that when you, and so that when you're in that position to then kind of commit to that purchase, you've already, learned about the process, met the artist, sat and had a cup of tea or a bad cup of coffee, or even better, it's after 5, a glass of wine, whatever the situation is, and you can develop that relationship. And then, as you said, commit to that piece when you are ready.
Yes.
Yeah, for me at first, I'd really like kind of like meeting the artist and getting to know them, but along the way I got disillusioned, because like some artists, then they start kind of trying to shift in terms of the style that they do, and then you don't like the new style, and it kind of then start interfering with kind of like the relationship that you develop, because the artists, whatever they produce, they send it to you, kind of like, you have to see my latest work, and then you look at it, it's just not speaking to you. So I thought that maybe I just need to enjoy the art more, because it's more about the art, rather than the artist, because sometimes, some artists are very, because of the creativity that they have, they are complex beings. I remember kind of like, getting a call, from one of the young kind of like, emerging, artists, being, a couple of years ago, when they were at the one of the big art, the Venice one, and things were going kind of like very, wrong. So where it started crossing from being kind of like enjoying your art and having to, to look emotionally after the artist as well, when things go south.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always say at that point, had everyone been aware of what a complete misogynist Picasso was, would anyone really have collected him in a contemporary context? But, I'm not about to take on the Picasso airs over that particular point. Now, in terms of wrapping up, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Turbine, for having invited us onto this. And all I can say for any artists, collectors, or anyone out there, stalk people digitally on things like Instagram, go through all the viewing rooms at Turbine. There really is some incredible art. As Glynis pointed out earlier, that Tanya, of course, features in the woven section. So there really is an opportunity to see some incredible things. And then also in your own personal time, if you're wanting to start looking at collecting and kind of, creating that passion, then approach, if you're in Gauteng, go to places like the Bag Factory, which is a consortium of artist studios, or in Cape Town, you've got Greatmore Studios. Find out where those big studio areas are. It's a great way of learning more about art and kind of getting that entry point. And again, as everyone on the panel has said today, it's really about that passion and that connection that you make with your collection and with your artworks.
Thank you. Before we close, just one thing that we didn't touch on, but I think that it's very important, and we need to figure out in terms of how we do it. I just think that our government has been very lousy in supporting the arts, and
very
that the art is a very kind of like public kind of like discourse. I'm really disappointed in terms of just like the lack of understanding from our government in terms of the role of art, what art can do in society. Although we saw kind of like what kind of like protest theater had done, under apartheid, there's just like a lack of that, and at some stage as a art community, surely we need to sort of, do something about it.
Absolutely. From my side, I would like to see the government commit to actually funding the insurance for their various institutions, which would actually allow them to exhibit their collections as opposed to leaving them in sort of permanent storage. And I think that's a role that all of us can play as collectors and as supporters of the arts, is actually becoming more active and, getting rid of that filter that society tells us we should have in terms of being polite, and to really just tackle these institutions and these platforms and actually make them step up. It's an incredibly valid point. Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, everyone. I think we've gone slightly over time, but thank you for joining us, and hopefully everyone enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.